since I actually started making Grimgar content here on YouTube since, let's see. Oh, Jesus, it's already been a year. It's been a year of me making Grimgar content. Holy shit. I've actually been getting requests here and there asking me to do a full review on every book that has come out on Grimgar. For those of you who are not aware, I actually did do 2 reviews on volume 18 and 19, but I have not reviewed all the novels from volume 1 all the way to like 17. And since volume 19 is actually already got a release date coming, I thought I'd get started on reviewing each individual books, starting at volume 1, going all the way to 17, and hopefully by that point, volume 18 will drop. And fair warning, just because I love Grimgar does not mean I'm going to be nice to these reviews. So I may take a sledgehammer approach to certain subjects in these books, and possibly be a little meaner than I have been in past videos, because I have talked about the flaws I have with Grimgar in the past, and may repeat some of those flaws in these videos. So I'll try to tone that down, because I don't want to repeat the same thing I've said in other videos, but there's going to be some overlap when it comes to things I've said in the past and things I'm going to be saying in these videos. Also, this is like my 3rd read-through of these novels, so expect full spoilers when I talk about certain things in this story. And I'm going to probably spoil things that are going to happen in the future, and certain things that this book sets up. I'm going to talk about things I like and the things I dislike. It's not going to be a scripted video, so I'm going to jump around a little bit here and there. But for the most part, I'm going to talk about the plot and my overall rating at the end of the video. I'm going to try my best to stay in chronological order throughout the book, but I will probably have some times where I skip around. Also, FYI, the version of the book that I'm reading is off of Kindle. And I am aware that there are certain translation problems depending on where you're reading the book, because apparently there's multiple different translations of Grimgar out there. Most people tell me to go check out J Novel Club, but unfortunately with me being legally blind, I prefer actually having Kindle because I can use my text-to-speech on there. I don't know if J Novel Club has that. If it does, let me know. I might just do a reread from J Novel Club in that case. For today, we're doing volume 1 of Grimgar off of Kindle. But let's get started with Grimgar, A Fancy Nash. Level 1. Whispers, Charm, Prayers, Awaken. As we all know, the story starts with Haru and the rest of the team waking up in pitch black darkness, and I think this part of the story is actually very interesting. I do think that the initial starting point of Grimgar has always been a really fascinating section of the story up until a certain point, which I'll get to. Memories are gone, and you're waking up in the Tower of Mystery with maybe some little candles lighting around. I think the characters' initial thoughts and panics are very valid, and I absolutely love this part. The part where it gets kind of weird to me is where the writer starts like describing stuff. You can kind of tell that the writer of Grimgar is a bit of an amateur with the way he describes certain things in the story. For example, Renji's description of what he looks like is really, really awkward. Initially, it sounds fine. Spiky white hair. I get that. It's fine. But then the writer proceeds to describe him as dressed like a gangster. And at one point, he starts shaking the bars that are separating them from the outside world. And the writer describes it as he shakes the... He shook the iron gate violently like a gangster would. What? Man, let me... And that's just an awkward way of describing something that actually I had to talk about it because it was really funny. I don't know why someone would describe it that way. I'm guessing it's a translation error or an issue in translation, or maybe it could be just something from Japan, the way to describe something. I don't know. I just thought it was really funny. It's not like a huge bad thing, but it has moments throughout the books, at least in the earlier parts of Grimgar, where he describes certain things and they're kind of awkward. Not terrible, but just like awkwardly described stuff. He gets a lot better as the story goes on, and you can see his writing actually get better and better throughout the books of Grimgar. Another thing that I kind of have issues with him in the early books is his pacing. Because if you're someone going into Grimgar, you might have a problem with how slow the pacing is initially. And I'm someone who likes slow pacing in books. The thing is, if you're going to have slow pacing, you have to have stuff that's really interesting in the early parts of the story. The problem with early Grimgar Volume 1 is that some of the stuff that they're showing off is more or less just Haru being insecure. Like him being insecure about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, or trying to like touch someone by accident. He freaks out about stuff. And I understand that's his characterization. That's fine. But the thing is, it's followed up by Ranta being extremely obnoxious, Chihiro being absolutely worthless at early parts of the story, Yume just being dumb. We then have to follow Haru through the entirety of him like walking through Alterna, trying to figure things out. And what he figures out isn't necessarily that important to the overall story. He gets bits of information, but we as the audience are looking for information as well to this world. But if Haru's just getting something like, oh, I know where to get meat on a stick now. I know how much this cost. I know some information about the bank system. The bank system, mind you, that doesn't really come back into play very much through the story. So ultimately, it's not that important. And we kind of have an idea of where, like, the monarch of the town lives. And that's not really all that important in the long term of the story. So it kind of feels a bit of a waste. And it takes about 42 pages or 2 whole chapters to get through. Which I recognize doesn't sound that bad when I tell you how many pages it is. But essentially, you're dealing with Haru being insecure, Ranta being annoying, Yumi being stupid, Shiro panicking and crying all the time, Haru lost, Haru getting no information, and then finding Minato, and now they're starting their actual, like, training to join a guild. And that's a decent amount of time of basically mostly fluff with some introduction to the characters. The only thing that's important in that entirety of those 2 chapters is them waking up in Dark Cave and the mystery of where the hell they are, and Brittany explaining to them what being a volunteer soldier is and their options in this world. Also, the introduction and foreshadowing of this dumb she'll come back later in Volume 15. Don't worry. It's gonna be a long time before we see this fucking foul meh. The thing is, this is done completely on purpose. The whole point of these characters early on basically being almost completely worthless is that show you how good they get later on in the story. It has to start in extreme levels of annoyance for you to be satisfied with just how much these people change. You can probably argue Haru not finding any information that has any long-lasting importance to the story helps reinforce how basically shitty he is early on. It still doesn't overall excuse an entire waste of a chapter of him looking around the town and getting absolutely nothing, and basically wasting the reader's time. Especially since you don't need to really look that hard to show how incredibly bad these characters are early in the story. Like, we get it. Also, keep in mind, these are like 16-year-olds. They're f***ing idiots. But eventually, they do start to get into their guilds. They start to actually adventure out. And that's where the story starts to pick up a little bit. It does get interesting because you get to see their finances, which I think, I know a lot of people don't find this interesting. I find it really interesting to find out how people survive in an alternate world, with how they talk about their finances, how much it costs to live in this rundown house for a couple days, how much does it cost to fix underwear, how much does it cost to eat daily, the fact they have to carry their stuff around all the time because they can't keep it in their house because someone could rob them. I think that's amazing. I've made videos talking about this before, and I really find that all really interesting. And Haru's dislike of the world and complaining about it also makes it kind of funny. And in terms of a plot, the story doesn't get its huge hook up until Minato actually dies. That's halfway through the book, mind you. Manato's death comes in at around roughly 128 pages in. That's slightly more than half the book. And up until Manato's death, I did struggle with keeping my brain turned on. I'm not gonna lie. And once Manato's dead, they bring in Mary to replace him as their healer. They all don't get along for a little while because they don't communicate because they're dumb 16-year-olds. Eventually, they realize that they need to cooperate and learn to talk to each other and understand that everyone has different problems. They learn that Mary's got a lot of trauma. God, does that woman have trauma? And then they open up to each other, talk, become actual teammates. I wouldn't call them friends by this point, by the way. I'd call them teammates. Even Haru calls them comrades instead of actually, like, friends. And then eventually, when they work together, they take revenge on the goblins who killed Minato. And that is basically the entire plot of the first book. But one of the things I really do like about the earlier parts of the story is they do set up a lot of stuff for the characters in the long term. They set up that Haru is really good at kind of like being perceptive of people around him. Or at least he is when he tries. Yume is good at understanding nature and how to survive in the world, but she's just kind of dumb. Ranta, as much as an idiot he is, he's actually pretty perceptive, whether he realizes it or not. He's one of the few people that calls Minato out on being an actual bad person, but pretending to be a good person. Those of you that don't know, read volume 14 plus, but Ranta calls him a guy that hides behind a smile, but he's actually a ruthless monster. And he does this as a way to, like, insult him, but he's actually spot on, and he doesn't realize it. And Ranta does stuff like this throughout the entirety of their early story. Minato early on in the story is focused so hard because it's just so obvious that he's carrying them, and it's one of the things that I really like about the first part of Grimgar is just how much he carries them is insane. He's being a secondary tank in the front lines, while also paying for Moguzu to stay alive because Moguzu was robbed early on. He's leading everyone, he's healing everyone, and he's trying to keep everyone's emotions in check so they don't do anything stupid or get really upset and sad. He's essentially someone who is a babysitter, and him dying makes total sense in the story. And when he dies, the story just got immediately better, and it's where the story gets really, really good. And the introduction of Mary also makes the story infinitely better, because Mary forces the other teammates to start to actually realize that they need to verbally talk to each other and actually communicate properly. At the end of the day, Grimgar Volume 1's main theme, I walked away realizing, was relationships. No matter how much you work in a relationship, if somebody else works less hard, it's going to fall apart. Monoto worked harder than anyone else in their party, and he died. It's not just that he carried their party through combat, but he was managing everyone's emotions, make sure everyone's happy, make sure everyone is like in a good place, and no one gave back as much as he was putting in. And when Mary comes in and she gives even less than Haru's entire party, it forces them to realize that they need to work harder. You also need to work on stuff like trusting each other, understanding that everyone else has different problems, and you should work with each other to solve these problems together. Everyone hated Mary early on, and then they realize that she has her own baggage, and then they kind of just like start to realize that they're kind of assholes for that. And then they try, and Mary doesn't make it easy on them. Mary is part of the problem. But Mary sees them trying, and she starts to try back eventually. And then they start succeeding and making serious progress. And it is essentially the story saying, if you put effort into a relationship, and the other person puts effort into a relationship, it's going to get better for everyone around you. And one of the things that I had a problem with early on in the light novel, funny enough, is the fact that a lot of the other characters don't get focused on very much, and we're mainly in the POV of Haru. And I realized at near around the middle part of the story that that's done on purpose, because Haru's also not paying that much attention to everyone else's problems as well, up until the point where they start paying attention to Mary's problem. And Haru starts opening himself up to what Ranta's dealing with, what Yumei's dealing with, what Shihiru's dealing with. He starts realizing everyone's got different baggage, different problems. One of the biggest things that I really love about the first light novel, and I think early Grimgar in general, is that the characters always talk about what they're going to do tactically. They'll talk about who they're going to target. They're going to talk about who they're going to fight, who they're going to hold off. If one of them can take on two people at once. It's one of the more interesting parts of the story because it feels like a D&D party planning out a ambush. And it's always really cool to get to that point in the story when they start actually planning things out properly. Because when they start planning early on, it's actually terrible. By terrible, I don't mean reading it. I just mean their plans are garbage. Because by that point in the story, you as a reader, if you know anything about RPGs, were probably thinking, this is really shitty planning. I think Mary is done so well in this book because she is someone who's very closed off and hurt and emotionally damaged. And once the characters eventually do start to get her to open up and start caring about her more and start inviting her to get food with them, she's still very awkward and shy, but she tries. That's one of the aspects about this book that I love so much. People aren't just instantly better. It takes them time to get better and better, and eventually Mary does become a little more open with like Haru and like talking to other people in their party, but she's still a very quiet and shy person. And this doesn't just magically go away after them resolving her sad emotional problems early on. She still has that baggage, and she still holds on to that for a very long time in the story. And seeing how it started early on is something that's really, really refreshing for me, because I just love how Grimgar deals with emotional damage and relationships in a group. That being said, I think level 1 or volume 1 of Grimgar is probably still the worst out of all the books. The early sections of the story just take a little too much time to get going, and the stuff that they do focus on is not very interesting to me, even though a lot of that stuff is characterization of them early on, and it helps set up for future stuff. It's still a drag to get through. I still think that Moguzu early on in the story kind of is the one who gets let down. This is mainly because he's killed off in volume 3, and they gave him more characterization in the bonus volumes later on. But I'm interested in seeing how I feel about him in the second book, because I think that he gets more stuff to do in the second book, but I can't remember, honestly. And I know this is a bit of a random thing, kinda, but I find it a little inconsistent that the story is about relationships and character flaws, but the moment the boys try to sneak into the girls' bathhouse, you don't really punish the boys in the light novel. Not really? In the anime, they do a fantastic job of correcting this by making the girls really uncomfortable around the guys, justifiably. And this is one of the things that the light novel just objectively does like not as well as the anime, because you wouldn't trust people who are trying to see you naked, especially when you realize they've known each other for less than a couple weeks. At least by the time Mato dies, it is at most a month. And since this happened before that, it's less than a month. Either way, doesn't matter. It just feels really weird that the writer thought that the girls wouldn't really be that creeped out by this. So yeah, I had to call that out. It's kind of a weird thing in the book. And in terms of like world building, the first book doesn't really do all that much, if I'm being honest. It gives you a giant exposition dump early on when it comes to like the stuff you get before the actual story, which I personally don't like reading that stuff because I don't like getting exposition dumped before the actual story. And while I am aware of the information that is set before the start of the story, I don't like getting the information in a giant dump if it's not given to you organically. But that doesn't stop the first volume of Grimgar for being a really good starting point for the overall story. And with all that in mind, I'd have to give the first book of Grimgar probably a C+, at most, if I'm being generous, a B-, just because that early pacing really isn't great for me, and having to deal with the early Grimgar characters, while I know is set up for the future, is still a very annoying drag, personally. But I still love the overall theme of needing to work together, and you should still sympathize with each other. And I cannot wait to get to book 2. Let me know what you guys thought about this in the comments down below. And if you guys want to see more from me, please check out my Twitch, my gaming YouTube, my TikTok, my Instagram. All that stuff is in the description. I live stream on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.